The Central Cooperative left behind 61 acres of sunflowers. The oil press paid off her farm. Sarah Miller was 34 years old and owned a farm inherited from her father that was about to slip away from her. The notice arrived without any warning, as the worst news tends to, inside a yellow envelope that the mailman left in the mailbox without ringing the bell. There were 61 acres of ripe sunflowers swaying outside, golden and untouched, with nowhere to go. And it was right there, standing in the middle of the empty barn with the crumpled paper in her hand, that she understood she would need to find a way to turn those forgotten sunflowers into something capable of saving the land her father had left her. What she didn't know yet was that the answer had been rusting at the bottom of that same barn for decades, waiting for someone who wasn't afraid to start over. 3 days before receiving the notice, Sarah had woken up at 5 in the morning, as she always did. It was October, and the air had that lightness of not yet knowing what the day would bring. The sky was still overcast when she crossed the yard toward the barn, the flashlight in her hand, swinging with the hurried steps of someone with much to do, before the sun truly warmed up. The harvest was ready. She knew it by looking at the fields every day, watching the color of the petals that were already beginning to give way, the flower heads heavy with seeds. She had even done the math the night before. If the cooperative came to pick it up the following week as agreed, it would cover at least half of what she owed the bank that quarter. The other half she would settle with the second payment in December. She had put that plan together with the care of someone building a wall brick by brick. There was no wiggle room, there was no margin for error, but it was a plan that worked, and that was enough for her. The letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. Sarah was in the kitchen when she heard the mailman's car on the dirt road. It wasn't a day for important mail, so she didn't hurry. She finished washing the mug she'd used for her 3 o'clock coffee, dried her hands on the dish towel hanging by the stove, and walked to the mailbox with the same calm pace as always. The envelope was yellow, the kind with a plastic window showing the recipient's name. The cooperative's logo was stamped in the top left corner. She opened it right there, standing at the edge of the road, with the wind carrying the scent of the sunflowers. She read it once, reread it, read it a third time. The cooperative was ending the distribution contract with immediate effect, claiming that the volume produced on Sarah Miller's property no longer justified the logistics of the route. The text was formal, cold, and brief. 3 paragraphs. No apology, no suggested alternative. A signature she recognized: Richard Sterling, Operations Director. She folded the paper, stuffed it into her apron pocket, and went back inside the house. She sat at the kitchen table for a time she couldn't measure. The clock on the wall read 4:42. The afternoon light came in through the side window, that golden light she had always found beautiful. Outside, the sunflowers kept swaying as if nothing had happened. The farm was mortgaged. That was the most concrete fact of all. 3 years ago, when David left to take care of his mother in a town up north and simply never came back, Sarah was left alone with the debts he had embedded in the land. It wasn't overnight that she understood the size of the hole. It came in pieces, as truly painful things always do. First the bank statement that didn't add up, then the manager's call, then the documents she had to dig through to find what had been signed without her knowledge. David wasn't a bad man. He was a man who hadn't managed to be big enough for the life he had. She had reached this conclusion without resentment, after a long time, and had held on to it like someone holds onto a truth that serves no purpose, but at least stops hurting once you stop fighting it. The bank had set a deadline. She had secured it with the contract from the Central Cooperative. Now the contract had disappeared, and the deadline was counting down the last 90 days. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay with her eyes open, listening to the wind moving through the sunflowers outside, that soft, steady sound that sometimes calmed her, but that night sounded like a taunt. 61 acres of ripe flowers with nowhere to go. Weeks of work, months of care, her father's land, the family name, all hanging over a chasm she had to cross in 90 days. She thought of her father. Arthur Miller had worked that land for 43 years, from dawn to dusk, with calloused hands and the stubbornness of someone who refuses to let the land defeat the man who respects it. He had left the farm to Sarah Miller when he passed 4 years ago, with that quiet certainty of someone who knows they're placing the inheritance in the right hands. She couldn't let herself be the last of the family to set foot on that land as its owner. Around midnight, she got up. She turned on the light in the shed and walked to the back, where the old tools her father had never thrown away were kept. It was a habit of his, save everything. Bent nails, rusty chains, punctured pipes. He used to say that a man who throws things away early ends up needing them late. She had grown up hearing that and had inherited the habit along with the land. It was in the darkest corner of the shed, behind a black tarp folded over itself, that she found the press. It was a heavy machine, made of cast iron, with bolts the size of fists and a frame that looked like it was built to last forever. Sarah recognized it. She remembered her father talking about it when she was little, with that boyish enthusiasm he had when he discovered a new project. He had bought the press with the intention of extracting sunflower oil directly on the property, cutting out the middleman, selling with a better margin. The idea had never left the drawing board because the cooperative had come along soon after, with a contract that seemed good and was easier than starting something new from scratch. The press had been left aside, rusted, forgotten. She placed her hand on the cold iron and stayed like that for a moment. Then she went to get a flashlight and examined the machine carefully. The main mechanism seemed intact. There was rust on the joints, stuck nuts, a belt that was dry and broken in 2 pieces. But the frame was solid. The central screw, which was the heart of the press, turned when she forced it with both hands. Slowly, stuck, but it turned. Sarah stood there in the middle of the night with the flashlight pointed at that old machine, and for the first time since she had read the letter, she felt something different inside her chest. It wasn't certainty. It was just a tiny spark, the kind of thing that vanishes if you blow on it too hard. She went to sleep without blowing on it. The next morning she woke up at 5 as usual and went straight to the sunflowers. She walked among the plants with her hands open, touching the petals, looking at the seeds, calculating with her eyes what she would later calculate with pencil and paper. The field had that specific silence of mornings in Minnesota, a silence that isn't an absence of sound but a different presence, the bird song and the rustling leaves that compete with nothing. She went back to the house, opened the notebook she used for the farm accounts and started doing the math. If she could press 30% of the harvest and turn it into artisanal oil, the volume would be enough to cover the debt with a small but real margin. It was an account that seemed simple, and its simplicity was both encouraging and frightening, because between the paper and reality there was a gap full of obstacles she could barely see yet. But the numbers added up, and that was what mattered at that moment. Mr. Benjamin lived 2 miles down the dirt road, in a red brick house surrounded by a garden his wife had planted decades ago, and that he still tended with the same devotion as when she was there, as if watering the plants was a way of talking to her. He was 72, with completely white hair, hands that showed a lifetime of working with machines and processes, and a way of listening that made the person speaking feel like every word mattered. He wasn't a man of many words, he was a man of much listening, which is different and rarer. He had worked for nearly 40 years in the local dairy industry, first as a production line worker, then as a process supervisor, until he became the technical manager of a small cooperative before retiring. What he had learned in those decades wasn't in any manual. It was in his hands, in his body's memory, in the ability to look at a machine and sense what it needed. He had returned to the small town where he was born after retiring without much fuss. He had no children living nearby. His only daughter lived down south with her own family, sent a message every week, came for the holidays. He didn't complain. He had learned early on that life doesn't hand things out the way you imagine when you're young, and that the question is what you do with what's left. The quiet life didn't weigh on him. Sarah Miller knocked on his door on a Wednesday morning, with her account ledger under her arm, and the letter from the cooperative in her pocket. He greeted her with a cup of coffee that was right on time, with that strong drip brew smell she associated with the homes of people who live alone and keep their routines with precision. He sat down across from her without asking questions before she finished speaking. She told him everything. The letter, the debt, the press, the sunflowers, the 90 days. She spoke without exaggerating and without downplaying, in the same straightforward way she had inherited from her father, along with the land and the habit of saving bent nails. Mr. Benjamin listened to everything without interrupting a single time. When she finished, he was silent for a moment, looking at his coffee cup, as if he was checking something he had thought of himself. Then he simply said, "Let me take a look at that press." They walked to the farm. The 2-mile walk down the dirt road happened in silence, with the sound of their footsteps on the dry earth and the wind passing through the fields. He examined the plants as they walked, looking at the sunflowers, with the attention of someone who understands agricultural production. "They're ready," he said at one point without stopping. "I know," said Sarah. In the shed, he examined the machine in silence for at least 20 minutes, turning parts, pulling connections, testing the center bolt with hands that still had a lot of strength. Sarah stood to the side without saying anything, respecting that silence like someone waiting for a doctor's diagnosis. When he came out from under the press, he had an expression she read as cautious. It wasn't enthusiasm. It wasn't discouragement. It was the expression of someone who had seen the problem clearly and was already thinking about the solution. "The frame is good," he finally said. "Needs a new belt. The joints want grease, and there are some seized bolts we can fix with patience. But it works. We can make it work." "Do you think it's viable?" she asked. He turned to look at her with those calm eyes she had learned to respect in the few times she had talked to him in previous years. "Viable, yes. Easy, no. Those are different things." Sarah nodded. "I know." "Then we'll see what can be done," he said simply, as if he were agreeing to help carry a box, rather than stepping into the middle of a battle that had barely begun. They stayed until dark, analyzing the press, discussing the process, asking questions and answering them. Mr. Benjamin talked about the cold press extraction method, about the care needed with temperature to avoid affecting the oil's quality, about the type of packaging that worked best for an artisanal product. It was information he had gathered over decades, flowing out with the natural ease of someone who had carried it for so long that it no longer felt heavy. Before leaving, he said, "I have a notebook with processes that my supervisor there documented when I worked at a small vegetable oil operation years ago. I never threw it away." Sarah found that amusing, because it was exactly the kind of thing her father would have kept too. "Bring it tomorrow," she said. He came back the next morning with the notebook under his arm, a time-worn brown leather cover with pages full of that small, organized handwriting of someone who takes notes because they know they'll need them. He also brought a discreet smile, like someone who had spent the night remembering things he thought he had forgotten. The partnership was born right there, with a firm handshake in the heat of an October afternoon, the scent of earth and sunflower around them, and the long shadow of the old shed covering them both. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us beginners out. Now, moving on. The real work started 2 days later, when Jack showed up at the farm. Jack was about 40, thin, a man of few words and a lot of observation, with hands that seemed made specifically for working with metal. He was the mechanic at the junkyard on the edge of town, a place that from the outside looked like a scrap heap, but inside held a private order that only he fully understood. He had fixed things that other mechanics had declared dead, and in town his reputation spread without needing any advertising. Sarah had called him the night before. He arrived promptly at 7 in the morning with a toolbox that looked heavier than any person should carry alone. He examined the press in silence for a solid 20 minutes. He tapped it with a rubber hammer in several spots, shook the parts, looked underneath with a flashlight he pulled from his coveralls pocket. Then he stood up with his hands on his hips, staring at the machine, as if having a conversation no one else could hear. "It can be done," he said, "but I'll need 2 parts I don't have here. I'll see if I can find them deep in the back of the yard. If I do, I'll have it ready by Friday." "Will you find them?" she asked. He paused briefly. "I have a knack for these things," he said. "I always keep parts that seem useless. I never know why at the time. Later, I know." Sarah didn't ask how much it would cost. First, because Jack was the kind of man who charged fairly, and she already knew that from his reputation around town. Second, because at that moment, She needed to know if it was possible before knowing what it cost. He found the parts in the back of the yard on Thursday afternoon, just like he said he would, and came back on Friday at 7 sharp. While Jack worked on the press, Sarah and Mr. Benjamin cleaned out the shed. They scrubbed the floor with water and soap, removing layers of accumulated dust her father had left behind without malice, simply because there were more pressing things to do. They installed reclaimed wooden shelves that had been leaning against another corner, still sturdy. They set up a simple bench for the packaging process, using boards Mr. Benjamin had in his garage. They covered the windows with fine mesh, bought at the downtown notion shop. Everything was done with whatever was available on the farm, and what Mr. Benjamin brought from his own house, because he was the kind of man who, when he decides to help, helps for real, holding nothing back for later. On Friday afternoon, Jack connected the adapted motor he had installed in place of the original manual mechanism and turned on the press for the first time. The machine made a noise that sounded like a protest, then another that sounded like an agreement, and then it began to spin with a steadiness that made the three of them look at each other in silence. Jack stood with his arms crossed, watching. Mr. Benjamin stood still near the workbench. Sarah stood beside the press with her hands on her apron. A trickle of golden oil started to flow down the outlet chute, slow at first, thin as a sewing thread, then a little thicker, then even firmer, flowing steadily, falling into the container Sarah had placed underneath, with the precision of someone who had calculated the right angle. None of them said anything for a moment that lasted longer than it seemed. Then Mr. Benjamin spoke, in a very low voice. "Just look at that." Sarah didn't answer. She kept staring at that golden stream with a mix of relief and fear she couldn't untangle, because every time something good happened in those days, she already expected the blow that would follow. The blow came, but not from where she expected. Richard Sterling was 66 years old, his hair completely white and combed to the side, with a precision he had maintained since his 40s, and the posture of someone who had spent a lifetime giving orders and never had to justify any of them. He had been the operations director of the Cooperative for over 20 years, long enough to know every producer in the region by name, by production volume, and, in some cases, by the size of their debt and their bank deadline. He had known Sarah since she was a girl, had known her father before that, and knew the farm with the kind of intimacy that comes from years of courtesy visits, cooperative meetings, and porch conversations where words sometimes mean more than they say. He knew the real value of the land. He knew about the mortgage, and he had an interest. It wasn't an interest he declared openly. Richard Sterling had never been the kind of man who reveals what he wants before he's sure he's going to get it. His method was more subtle. Circulate through the local businesses, talking to people, drop comments here and there, plant an idea that would grow on its own without anyone needing to know where the seed came from. He had done this before with other properties. Two of them, which had gone through the same route of debt and bank deadlines, were now part of a larger investment involving his name and that of Gerald Thorne, without anyone in town knowing the pattern. In the week following the letter he himself had signed, Richard began showing up in conversations at general store counters, at afternoon gatherings at the Square's bar, and on courtesy visits to merchants he had maintained relationships with for decades. What he said varied a little depending on who was listening, but the core was always the same. The Miller farm was in a tough spot, the bank deadline was approaching, and it was almost certain the land would go to auction soon. Gerald Thorne, who was the second major partner in the cooperative and had grown up alongside Richard, in a kind of friendship founded on shared interests, reinforced the narrative whenever he could. Gerald was 68 years old, had a grey moustache he had kept since his 40s, and the ability to seem friendly while doing things that weren't friendly at all. He was the kind of man everyone thought they knew well, but in reality, no one really knew. The two of them had a simple plan. Wait for the farm to reach its limit, make an offer well below market value, and then split the property between themselves. The operation was clean because they used intermediaries and never put their own names on the first contacts. Sarah didn't know any of this yet. She was in the shed with Mr. Benjamin at her side, learning the extraction process while the press was working. The days were long and physical, with a lot of manual effort, a lot of temperature adjustments, a lot of discarded first batches that didn't meet the quality they had set as standard. Mr. Benjamin was demanding in a way she initially thought was excessive, but he explained, with the patience of someone who's taught many things in life, "You're not going to compete on price. Never. On price, the big guys always win. You're going to compete on quality, and quality doesn't forgive carelessness." She understood, and she stopped complaining about the discards. The first production that came out within standard was 12 glass bottles Sarah had bought from a wholesale in the neighboring town with simple cork caps. She lined them up on the new shelf in the shed and stood looking at them for a moment. The oil had that golden color that the late afternoon light in the shed transformed into something that seemed lit from within, as if the flour were still present in some form inside the liquid. Mr. Benjamin looked at the bottles for a while and said, "This here needs a label." "I know," said Sarah. "But before the label it needs registration." She had already researched the day before, after a phone call with an acquaintance who had experience with artisanal products. To sell as a food product, even if artisanal and small scale, she needed a technical report, health registration, and adjustments to the production space that would be evaluated by an inspector. The bureaucracy was real. So was the deadline. "How long does it take?" asked Mr. Benjamin. "It depends on how it goes," she said. "But we need to start soon. Tomorrow morning, I'll go there." The next day, she went to the city's health department and spent the entire morning talking to receptionists, filling out forms, and trying to understand what needed to be done. The process was more complicated than she expected, but not impossible. An inspector would need to visit the shed to assess the conditions. Depending on the result of the visit, the registration could be issued in 3 weeks or take months. 3 weeks she had. Months she didn't. She returned home with a list of requirements and a weight she hadn't taken to the city. She sat on the porch with the list in her hand and read it item by item, marking with a pencil what was already done and what needed to be resolved. Half was reasonable, the other half needed work. That night she called Mr. Benjamin on the phone. "I have a list," she said. "Bring it over early tomorrow," he replied. "We'll sort it out." Over the following days, the farm turned into a work site. Sarah and Mr. Benjamin worked from dawn until dark, adjusting the shed to meet every requirement on the list. They covered the windows with proper food production grade screens. They reorganized the internal flow to clearly separate the seed storage area, the processing area, and the bottling area, each with its own logic and space. They installed a temporary sink near the bottling bench using a pipe Mr. Benjamin brought from home, along with an old faucet that worked like new. They painted the floor of one section with washable paint the old man had saved from a renovation project he'd done 5 years earlier. Every adjustment took time. Every detail required attention. And while they worked to meet the inspector's requirements, the days of the bank's deadline kept passing with the indifference that days have toward people's urgencies. And it was on one of those days, while Sarah was with her back turned painting the shed wall, that Mrs. Martha became the topic of conversation. Mrs. Martha's general store was the busiest establishment in the center of town. 59 years old, with a memory that never forgot a face or a product and a commercial instinct that had kept the general store afloat while others around it closed, she had been a friend of Sarah's mother for many years and knew the Miller family with the kind of affection that doesn't need frequent visits to stay real. It was Mrs. Martha's daughter, Emily, 26 years old, who stopped by the farm one afternoon to pick up eggs as she did from time to time. She came in through the wooden gate of the yard calling for Sarah and found the house seemingly empty. She went to the shed, saw the open door, and walked in. What she found was a counter with 12 bottles lined up in the afternoon light, that liquid gold that anyone with eyes could recognize as extraordinary. "That's beautiful," she said out loud, not realizing Sarah had appeared behind her. "I made it right here," Sarah said, "with the sunflowers from the property." Emily picked up a bottle carefully, swirled it in the light, watched the liquid shine. "My mum would love this. She uses sunflower oil in everything she makes." Sarah offered Emily a bottle as a gift to take with her. It wasn't calculated generosity. It was the impulse of someone who has something good and wants to share it without yet thinking about how much it could yield. 3 days later, Mrs. Martha called. It was 5 in the evening when the phone rang. Sarah was in the shed checking the volume of oil produced that day and didn't recognize the number right away. "Sarah, what a wonderful oil this is," Mrs. Martha said, with that lively voice of someone already calculating as she spoke. "I made a carrot cake and a pan-fried chicken. It came out different. My customers here tried it too. They wanted to buy it." "I'm glad, Martha. Do you have more to sell?" Sarah paused for a second before answering. "I have the product, but I don't have the formal registration to sell yet." There was a short pause. "Are you working on it?" "I am." "Then let me know when you get the paperwork," Mrs. Martha said, "because I'll put it on the shelf without hesitation, and I'll sell it, I guarantee you." Sarah hung up the phone and stood quietly for a moment in the shed, with the afternoon light coming through the open window and the oil in the bottles shining on the shelf. It was the first good news she had received since the Cooperative's letter. It had the mixed taste of relief and pressure, because now there was an open window, and she needed to go through it before it closed. She called Mr. Benjamin. "There's a buyer waiting," she said. "Then we'll move faster," he replied. But while they were speeding up the shed's preparation, Richard Sterling had arrived first. Richard's visit to Mrs. Martha's general store happened on an afternoon when she was alone, which wasn't common. The clerk had left early, and Emily was in the neighboring town handling a college matter. Richard came through the door with his usual calculated politeness, bought 2 products he didn't need, and chatted with Mrs. Martha as she wrapped them up. "Martha, I heard you're thinking about working with Sarah Miller's oil." She didn't answer right away. There was something in the tone of the question she didn't like, but she couldn't name it at the moment, as sometimes happens when intuition arrives before reasoning. "I'm considering it," she said carefully. "You know the product still doesn't have registration, right?" he said, still with that same friendly tone. "Selling a product without registration could bring trouble to your establishment. Health department inspections, fines. I'm not saying it will happen, but the risk is there. If it gets the registration, no problem," she said directly. Of course," he agreed, with a speed that sounded like a retreat. "But you know how it is. These small rural operations rarely manage to get everything properly regulated. It's a lot of bureaucracy for someone working alone." He left shortly after, with a smile and a wave. Mrs. Martha stood behind the counter, thoughtful, looking at the door through which he had left. That afternoon, after closing the general store, she called Sarah. "Sarah, Richard Sterling stopped by." Sarah was quiet. "What did he say?" Mrs. Martha told her, word for word, with the honesty that was her hallmark. Sarah listened to everything without interrupting. When Mrs. Martha finished, the silence lasted about 3 seconds. "Martha, when I have the registration in hand, can I come by?" "Of course, dear. You can come with everything you've got. Thank you for telling me." She hung up. She sat in the kitchen chair for a moment, with the phone in her hand. Night had fallen outside, and the sky was clear, that deep blue that precedes the first stars. The anger she felt at that moment was clean, without a tremor. It wasn't the kind of anger that knocks you down, it was the kind that holds you up. She went to the shed and worked until 11 o'clock that night. The inspector's visit happened on a morning with an overcast sky, 10 days after the first trip to the health department. The man's name was Henry, about 45 years old, with thin-rimmed glasses and a clipboard he held with the seriousness of someone who knows that every note they make can change someone's life. He arrived promptly at 8 in the morning in a white service car that stopped right in the middle of the yard. Sarah received him at the shed door with Mr. Benjamin at her side. The two had been awake since 5, reviewing every detail one last time, checking each point on the list. Henry greeted them with a professional nod and went in. He walked through the shed in silence for a long time, pausing here and there to jot notes on his clipboard, testing faucets, checking window screens, measuring distances with a tape measure he pulled from his pocket. He asked about the production flow, about the origin of the seeds, about the equipment cleaning process before and after each shift. Sarah answered everything clearly and without exaggeration, with the same objective precision she used to do the math at the kitchen table. When he reached the press, Henry paused in a way different from the others. It wasn't the pause of someone taking notes. It was the pause of someone recognizing something. He tilted his head slightly to one side. "This machine," he said almost to himself. "I've never seen one like it up close, only in photos." "It's old," said Sarah. "It was my father's." "My grandmother had one similar in the countryside where she grew up," he said. "She used it to press other products." He paused. "I remember visiting her as a child, and the noise of that thing was the sound of the farm." Sarah didn't say anything, but there was a softening in the air that hadn't been there before. The inspector finished the inspection, stood in the middle of the shed, rereading his notes for a few minutes. Then he said, "There are 3 points that need adjustment before I can approve. I'll describe everything in writing. Do you have a deadline to fix them?" "I need to know how much time I have," replied Sarah. "I'll do the second visit in 10 days, he said. "If the 3 points are resolved, I'll give immediate approval, and the paperwork, I'll take care of speeding it up myself." Sarah waited for him to leave. She closed the shed door, stood in the silence for 2 seconds. Then she took a deep breath. 10 days, she said to Mr. Benjamin. "We'll handle it in 8, he replied. And they did. But while the two worked to pass the second inspector's visit, Richard Sterling had been advancing in the town's commerce. Sarah only found out about it when she visited other establishments a few days later, bringing information about the product and the prospect of the registration that was coming. Out of 4 general stores she visited that week, 3 closed the door before she could even finish speaking. Not rudely, but with that polite coldness of someone who has already had a previous conversation and made a decision. The 4th establishment, a tiny neighborhood general store that the whole town called Aunt Annie's Pantry because of the elderly owner behind the counter, accepted with restrictions. The bottles would go on the lowest shelves, positioned so they wouldn't catch anyone's eye right away. Sarah left the 4th establishment with a folded paper in her pocket. It wasn't much, but it was something, and she had learned to respect beginnings. What she didn't know yet was what had happened at the 3 establishments that had closed their doors. She found out a few days later when Patricia stopped her on the street. Patricia was 23, a clerk at one of the general stores that had refused, and she had studied with Sarah's niece in high school. They were acquaintances who exchanged greetings, the kind of small-town relationship that isn't friendship, but has enough intimacy for an honest conversation. "Sarah," she said, in the tone of someone who isn't sure if she should speak, but has decided she must. "I feel bad for not telling you sooner, but Richard Sterling was here." Sarah stopped. "When?" "2 days before you showed up. He talked to my boss, said your product was irregular, that it could cause legal trouble for the establishment. My boss got scared." "Did you hear that conversation?" "I was the one who brought them coffee. I tried not to listen, but I did." She paused. "Did you know?" "I'm finding out now," Sarah said. She thanked Patricia and kept walking. The clarity of things sometimes arrives with a weight that surprises you. She had been fighting a war, and only now did she fully understand that the battlefield was larger than she had realized. That night, sitting on the wooden porch her father had built with his own hands decades ago, she told Mr. Benjamin everything. The old man had shown up uninvited around 6, with the excuse of wanting to check how the window adjustment they had made the day before was holding up. He listened in silence, his face calm, his eyes on the horizon, where the sun was fading behind the sunflower field. "He's trying to tighten the noose before you get the license," Mr. Benjamin said. "I know. Do you know why he wants the farm?" Sarah was quiet for a moment. "For the land," she said. "Its real value is almost triple the debt. If he buys it for what I owe, he'll double his money." Mr. Benjamin nodded slowly. "And he knows you have no other way to sell your product without him." "He knew," Sarah said, "but the alternative is the press, which he doesn't know exists." She was silent for a moment. "Not yet." Mr. Benjamin looked at her with that expression of someone who recognizes something. "Then we'll move faster than him," the old man said. Sarah stared at the horizon as the last colors of the sun faded away. "I have an idea," she said, "but I need the license first." Henry's second visit happened 7 days later, not 10. Sarah had called him on the night of the 6th day, asking him to come sooner if there was an opening in his schedule, with the straightforward explanation that she was up against a deadline. He checked his calendar and showed up the next morning. He went through the shed with the same attention as before, checking the 3 points he had pointed out on the first visit. Sarah walked beside him without speaking, letting him look at what he needed to look at without interference. The screen on the back window was correct. The spacing between the processing area and the bottling area was correct. The floor protection in the production section was correct. At the end, he made one last note on his clipboard and said, "It meets the requirements." "How long until the license comes through?" she asked. "If I prioritize the paperwork, about 10 days, maybe less." She nodded. "I truly appreciate it." He left. Mr. Benjamin, who had remained quietly by the workbench throughout the visit like a peaceful presence, waited for the sound of the car to fade down the road. "Next step," he said. "Next step," she confirmed. With the concrete prospect of the registration coming through, Sarah went to Martha's general store and gave an update on the progress. The woman listened, asked her to come back when the paperwork was in hand, and said she'd set aside space on the shelf. But at the other establishments in town, where Richard had stopped by, the doors remained closed. Sarah went home that afternoon with that feeling of someone who can see the path ahead, but knows it's narrow. Aunt Annie's pantry was buying, Martha was waiting. The little market in the neighboring town was still a possibility, but the numbers didn't add up with just that. It was a Thursday night when Mr. Benjamin said almost in passing, "There's the arts and crafts market in the neighboring town every Saturday. Good market. Folks there buy from outsiders, especially if the product is different." "I know that market," said Sarah. "You've never been as a seller." She didn't answer right away. "No, I haven't," she said after a moment. "There's a first time for everything." She was quiet for a moment, with the account book open on the table, looking at the numbers that still didn't add up. "If the registration comes through this week, we'll go the following Saturday," she said. "Then it'll come through this week," said Mr. Benjamin, with that calm certainty she had learned not to question. The registration came through on a Thursday afternoon, just as he'd said it would. Sarah was in the shed in the middle of a shift when the phone rang. It was Henry. "The registration has been issued," he said. "You can come pick up the documents tomorrow morning." She stood there with the phone in her hand for a second after he hung up. Then she went over to the workbench where Mr. Benjamin was checking the bottles from the day's batch and said without preamble, "It came through." He stopped what he was doing and looked at her. "It came through," she repeated. The old man nodded slowly, with that restrained smile that was all he had in terms of excitement. He picked up one of the bottles from the shelf, held it in the window light and gazed at the golden oil for a moment. "So now we've got product, we've got a name, and we've got the paperwork," he said. "We're missing the market," said Sarah. "We are," he confirmed. "Saturday we'll go find it." That same afternoon, without Sarah knowing, Gerald Thorne got in his car and drove to the farm. She was in the shed when she heard the engine on the road. She recognized the car by the model, stepped out to the door and waited. Gerald got out with a leather briefcase in his hand and the smile of a man who seems friendly to anyone who doesn't know him well. "Sarah," he said, with the calculated cordiality he used as his first layer for everything. "Great to run into you. May I come in?" "You can stay here," she said simply. He understood and stayed where he was. He opened the briefcase, took out a document, and handed it to her. It was a purchase offer for the farm. The value was clearly visible in numbers at the center of the page. Sarah read it, counted the zeros, did the mental math. Then she looked at Gerald. "That's less than half of what the property is worth." "Given the current situation," he said carefully, "it's an amount that solves the problem you've got." "You think I've got a problem? You've got a deadline," he said. "I do, and I'm handling it." Gerald looked at her with an expression that tried to be genuine concern, but didn't quite make it. "Sarah, you're alone in this, and the deadline is what it is. There's no magic trick to change that." "I'm not alone," she said. He was silent for a moment, maybe hoping she'd go on, that she'd explain. She didn't explain. Sarah folded the offer in half, handed it back to Gerald Thorne and said, "I'm not interested." Gerald's smile remained, but something in his eyes shifted. That small change that happens when a man used to winning realizes he might not win this time. "Are you sure?" he said. "I am." He picked up the folded paper, put it back in his briefcase carefully, and made to leave. Halfway between Sarah and the car, he stopped and turned. "You're a lot like your father," he said. "He was just as stubborn." Sarah didn't answer. He looked out at the 61 acres stretching across the field, that vast golden glow made more intense by the late afternoon, then got into his car and drove off without another word. Sarah stood in the yard until the sound of the engine faded. Then she went back to the shed, turned on the press, and worked until dark. On Friday, while Sarah went to town to pick up the registration, the press stopped. Mr. Benjamin was in the shed doing routine maintenance when he heard a crack that shouldn't have been there, a dry, sharp sound that didn't fit with the steady hum of the motor. He shut it off immediately and examined the inside of the mechanism with a flashlight. A small gear had given way. It wasn't the most imposing part of the press, but it was central to the whole compression system. Without it, the pressure wasn't enough to extract the oil from the seeds. When Sarah returned from town with the registration envelope in hand and a lighter heart than she'd had in weeks, she found Mr. Benjamin standing in front of the stopped press with a serious face. "What happened?" she asked, still at the door. He explained. She listened without changing her expression. Then she stood still, looking at the machine in silence for a moment. Finally she said, "Jack." "Jack," he confirmed. She called the mechanic right then. Jack arrived in the early afternoon, examined the gear, stood silent, thinking with his hands in the pockets of his coveralls. "I've got a spare part that might work," he said after a while. "It's not identical, but I can adapt it. A few hours of work." "Can you do it today?" she asked directly. He looked at her, then at the press, then at her again. "I can," he said. Jack stayed in the shed until dark. Sarah lingered nearby most of the time, bringing coffee, holding the flashlight when he needed to look at awkward angles. Mr. Benjamin stood near the workbench, silent. At 7 in the evening, Jack connected the adaptation he'd made, checked the fit, tested the joint by hand. Then he went to the motor and turned it on. The press ran. The golden stream flowed down the chute again with the steadiness they had learned to hear like a promise. Jack wiped his hands on a cloth and said, "Keep my number handy. Any unusual noise, call me before it breaks down completely." "Thank you, Jack." He nodded and left. Mr. Benjamin looked at the running press and said, more to himself than to Sarah, "This machine doesn't want to stop." Sarah looked at it for a moment. "It never should have stopped," she said. Saturday arrived with a clear sky and a temperature that seemed made for the occasion. Mr. Benjamin showed up at the farm at 6 in the morning with his old car warmed up, a cardboard box in the back seat, and that restrained early morning smile that was as enthusiastic as he ever got before 8. Sarah had woken up at 4. She sorted the bottles carefully, checked each one against the light, discarded 2 that weren't up to the color standard they'd set. She put on the labels she had drawn herself on a piece of white cardboard. Miller's Pure Oil, in clean letters, with a sunflower drawn by hand, carefully. It was a simple label. It was the kind of label that tells a story before you even read what's written. 48 bottles. Everything the press had produced since Jack's repair, minus the 20 bottles promised to Mrs. Martha, which would be delivered on Monday. The little farmer's market in the neighboring town took place on the central square, a large old square with a stone fountain in the middle and enormous trees casting shade over the stalls arranged in rows. There were honey producers with their miniature hives displayed on the counter, artisan cheesemakers, a woman selling sourdough bread with the seriousness of someone making art, another selling flowers from her own farm, another with preserves that smelled of herbs. An elderly vendor with a straw hat faded by the sun of many Saturdays occupied the space next to what was left at the end of the aisle. He saw Sarah arriving with the box in her hand and, without a word, helped set up the table. "First time?" he asked. "Yes." "Don't call out. Let the product call out. She arranged the bottles carefully, organized the labels so they were fully visible, placed an open bottle in the center with a toothpick holder of bread cubes beside it that the elderly vendor had cut and offered without her asking. The movement started slowly, as it always does at country markets. The first few people passed by, glancing without stopping. Some read the label. Few truly stopped. Sarah stood behind the table with her hands on her apron and let the bottles speak for themselves, just as the vendor in the straw hat had said. It was an elderly woman with completely white hair pinned up in a bun, wearing a floral apron over her Sunday clothes, who first truly stopped. She was in her mid-70s, a face full of history and a gaze that assessed seriously before opening up. She read the label. She read it again. "This is made around here?" "At my farm," said Sarah, "about a mile and a half down the road." "Real sunflower?" "Real sunflower. Pressed here this week." The woman picked up a toothpick with bread, dipped it carefully in the open oil, and tasted it slowly, with the attention of someone eating with all their senses. She was silent for a moment. Then she briefly closed her eyes. Then she opened them. "Oh my," she said. And she said it out loud, not on purpose, but because it just came out. A second woman passing by heard and stopped. A third stopped because the second had stopped. The vendor with the straw hat, without moving from his spot, looked at Sarah with a look that said she had gotten it right. Within 20 minutes, there were 8 people around the table. Within 30, there were more. The bottles began to sell slowly at first, then with a steadiness that Sarah hadn't calculated at the pace it was happening. The woman with the white bun, who had tasted first, bought 3 bottles. She lingered a moment while Sarah wrapped them up. "Are you coming back next Saturday?" she asked. "Yes," said Sarah. "Then I'll come get more, and I'll bring my sister. She makes a cake that would be perfect with this oil." The 48 bottles sold out before noon. Sarah stood behind the empty table for a moment, with the folded cardboard box beside her, the money in her apron pocket, and the orders from people she had jotted down on a crumpled piece of paper she'd pulled from her pocket when there was no more room to write. Mr. Benjamin came up beside her for the first time since she'd arrived. He had stayed about 50 feet away the whole time, watching without interfering. "How was it?" he said. "Everything sold out." "Any orders?" 4 orders written down, and the woman with the bun said she'd bring her sister. He was silent for a moment. "We're going to need to double the production," he said. "I know." And there was something in the tone of her voice that was different from anything he had heard since the day she knocked on his door with the ledger under her arm. It wasn't euphoria. It was something more solid. The satisfaction of doing something difficult and finding, in the result, that it had been worth every hour of work. On the way back to the farm, sitting in Mr. Benjamin's old car with the windows down and the wind blowing in, Sarah remained silent for a good stretch. Then she said, "Benjamin." "Thank you." He was silent for a moment. "The farm is yours," he said simply. "It always has been." The problem with doubling production was that the press had a daily limit that Mr. Benjamin knew precisely. To fulfill the orders for the little market, keep the contract with Mrs. Martha, Aunt Annie's pantry, and still make the numbers needed to pay off the debt, the current pace would fall short. They did the math together at the kitchen table one Sunday afternoon, with the account book open between them and the coffee growing cold without either of them paying it any mind. The numbers showed that even with the little market and the general store contracts, there was still an uncovered amount for the deadline. It wasn't a huge amount on paper. It was immense in reality, because at that point she had no room left for improvisation. "I need more production," said Sarah. "You can get production with more shifts," said Mr. Benjamin. "But for more shifts, you need more labor for bottling. The press runs on its own, but bottling is manual. There's Brenda." Mr. Benjamin looked up. Brenda was the daughter of the neighbor from the back road, 31 years old, who had lost her job at a warehouse in the city 3 months ago and had been looking for work for weeks. Sarah had known her since she was a girl. She had studied at the same school, knew she was hard-working, the kind who learns fast and doesn't need anyone looking over her shoulder. The next day, Sarah went to the neighbor's house and asked to speak with Brenda. The conversation was short and direct, the way Sarah liked it. "I can't promise much yet," said Sarah. "The work is real, it's manual, the hours are long. What I can pay is little, but it's honest. If sales grow, it'll increase. If they don't, I can't do anything about it." Brenda listened carefully. "When do I start?" she said. "Monday." "Then I'll show up Monday." She showed up Monday at 6 on the dot, in work clothes, and with a determination that made Mr. Benjamin nod in approval without saying a word. She learned the bottling process in 2 days, developed her own rhythm that was faster than either of the other two, and started suggesting small improvements in the workflow that Sarah and Mr. Benjamin adopted without pride, because a good idea has no owner, and the goal was the farm. With Brenda, production increased by 30% in the first week, but the bank deadline was approaching. 50 days, then 40, then 35. And it was when the numbers were finally getting close but still not there, when the path was visible but the distance still daunting, that Richard Sterling and Gerald Thorne decided to move forward in different ways. Richard went to the businesses. There were 2 more establishments that Sarah had visited in the last few days and that had shown interest in the product. Richard visited them before she could close the deal. He didn't say the product was bad, because that would be verifiable and could backfire on him. He said there were legal risks for anyone selling a product of rural origin without a proven track record of regularity in the market. It was a lie disguised as concern, and it worked because it had the right form. The 2 establishments turned her down the following week when Sarah went to confirm. She went home that afternoon with that weight that isn't discouragement, but is close to it. She sat on the porch. She stared out at the field. She had learned one thing in those years alone on the farm. Discouragement is a visitor. It shows up, stays a while, goes away if you don't throw a party for it. She didn't throw a party. She called Mrs. Martha. "Martha, I need some advice." "Mrs." Martha heard what was going on. She was silent for a moment. "You have the right product and the right paperwork," she said, "but Richard's ahead of you everywhere you go." "I know. So you need to get there before him." "How?" "You need a group that already believes in you before you even show up." Sarah stayed quiet, thinking. "What do you have in mind?" she said. "Give me a week," said Mrs. Martha. "But you guarantee me the product won't fail." "I guarantee it with everything I've got." "Then leave it to me." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and hit the like button and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now back to it. The week Mrs. Martha had asked for was one of the most tense for Sarah. She kept producing, kept delivering to Aunt Annie's pantry and to Mrs. Martha kept going to the little market on Saturdays, where the lady with the white bun had come back with her sister as promised, and the sister had bought 4 bottles and asked to have 4 more set aside for the following week. But the numbers still weren't adding up. She did the math every night at the kitchen table with a pencil and notebook, and always ended up in the same place. There was a shortfall that depended on something she didn't yet have. One of those late afternoons, Brenda was wrapping up her work when she stopped at the door of the shed. "Sarah." "You okay?" Sarah paused what she was doing and looked at her. "I'm fine," she said. Brenda stood for a moment in the doorway. "My mom asked about you yesterday. Said she's rooting for you." Sarah was silent for a second. "Tell her I appreciate it." Brenda nodded and left. Sarah was alone in the shed with that simple bit of information that, for some reason, hit deeper than she expected. More people were rooting for her than she could see. On Thursday of that week, Mrs. Martha called. "Sarah, can you come by the general store tomorrow at 4 in the afternoon?" "I can. What happened?" "Nothing bad," said Mrs. Martha, with that calm of someone holding back something she knows will surprise. "Just come." On Friday afternoon, Sarah arrived at Mrs. Martha's general store at exactly 4. She found the back room, where Mrs. Martha sometimes met with suppliers, with 6 people seated around a white plastic table. There were faces she knew, and 1 or 2 she only recognized by sight. There was Sam, from the Acacia Street warehouse, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a deep voice from someone used to giving weight to his words. There was Nancy, who had been selling bread and sweets at the North Precinct Bakery for over 20 years, a small woman who spoke little and understood a lot. There was Gus, from the corner market near the school, single, no nonsense, the type who got straight to the point. There was Grace, who had a small but busy produce stand downtown and a loyal clientele that bought everything she recommended. There was Silas, a retiree who had opened a health food store the previous year with the energy of someone who had found a new purpose for a second life. And there was Mrs. Martha, standing beside the table with a handwritten sheet of paper in her hand. "Sit down, dear," she said to Sarah. Sarah sat down. She looked at the people around her and at the paper Mrs. Martha had placed in front of her. It was text written in blue pen on notebook paper, simple, with no fuss. Proposal for collective advance payment for 3 months of supply of Miller's pure artisan oil. Each establishment had put down the amount they expected to use during the period. At the bottom, 7 signatures. Sarah read it slowly, reread it, tallied the total amount. The margin she was missing to clear the debt was right there, in a sum of 7 handwritten numbers. She stared at the paper for a time that felt long, but was probably less than 10 seconds. "Why are you all doing this?" she asked. Mrs. Martha was the first to speak, but she wasn't the only one. "Because the product is good," she said directly, "and my customers ask about it every week." "Because Sterling came around here trying to scare us," said Sam, with a frankness that left no room for interpretation. "And when a man runs to mess with someone, it's because he's afraid of what that person is building." "Because I tried that oil in the cake I made on Sunday," said Nancy simply. "And I was the one who called Mrs. Martha afterward." Sarah looked at her surprised. "You started this?" "I did," Nancy said without modesty. "I have a nose that doesn't lie." There was a moment of soft laughter around the table, the kind of laughter that isn't dismissal but relief. Sarah looked at each person around. "You understand that this is an advance payment for future delivery," she said, with the honesty that was the only way she knew how to do business. "If something goes wrong with the production, the money goes back. But I can't guarantee what's not in my hands." "We know what we're doing," said Gus. "We're not children." "And we don't believe it's going to go wrong," said Grace simply. Silas, who had remained silent until that moment, said, "I came from another town to start over here. I know what it's like to need someone who believes before they see the result. That's what we're doing." The silence after those words carried a different weight. Sarah picked up the pen that was on the table. She signed below the 7 signatures. The next morning she woke up at 5 as usual. She had coffee in silence, looked out the kitchen window at the sunflower field that was beginning to catch the sunlight. The early morning mist was still low over the field, that fine mist her father called the sunflower blanket. She stared for a moment. Then she picked up the documents she had organized the night before, put them in the envelope, and went to the bank. The branch was small in the center of town, with the smell of air conditioning and that specific silence of places where money changes hands. The manager who helped her had changed twice in the last 3 years, but she had kept the same weary courtesy with each one, because it did no good to be rude to someone just doing their job. The current manager received her at the scheduled time in a glass office with a view of the street. She placed the envelope on the table. He opened it, read the documents, checked the amounts, calculated in the system. He looked up at her. "It's all here," he said. "It's all there," she confirmed. The process took 40 minutes. There were forms, verifications, a second employee who came in to sign something. Sarah sat on the other side of the table with the posture of someone who had waited whole nights to reach this moment and would not let anxiety show at the wrong time. In the end, the manager printed the payment receipt, stamped it, and signed it. "It's settled," he said. She took the paper, folded it carefully in half, put it in her apron pocket. Outside there was a concrete bench in the shade of an old fig tree that had grown crooked on the sidewalk since before she was born. She sat down. The noise of the street continued around her. A bus passed, kicking up fine dust. A child ran on the sidewalk across the way. An older woman entered the bakery next door with a bag on her arm. Sarah sat with her hands in her lap for a time she didn't measure. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear. It was the kind of tremor the body makes when it releases something it has carried for a long time. Her face was still. There was one thing she hadn't told anyone. Not Mr. Benjamin, not Brenda, not Mrs. Martha. When her father was in his final days, he had asked her to get a box from the back of the old shed. Inside there were old documents, black and white photographs, and a worn hardcover notebook. On the last page of the notebook was a note written in the round, slightly slanted handwriting she had recognized since childhood. "This land is not mine. It belongs to whoever has the courage to work it. If that's you, be yourself." She had thought of that sentence in every tough moment over the past few weeks. When the press broke down, when the doors closed, when Gerald showed up with the offer, when the numbers just wouldn't add up. And she had thought of it now, sitting on that concrete bench, with the sun hitting her face and the fig tree casting a shadow that split the sidewalk in two. She folded that sentence in her mind and tucked it away along with the receipt. Then she got up and went home. The news reached both of them before the end of the day. In a small town, information moves at a speed any newspaper would envy. Someone had seen Sarah leaving the bank. Someone had recognized the look of someone who had made a final decision. The grapevine took shape on its own and reached wherever it reached. Richard Sterling found out in the afternoon. Gerald Thorne an hour later. They didn't consult each other at that moment, but the next morning, without planning it, both of them showed up at the farm. Sarah was in the shed with Brenda when she heard 2 cars pulling into the yard. She went to the window, looked outside. Richard getting out of his car, Gerald getting out of his. Both at the same time, standing in the yard looking at the shed, with the expression of 2 men who had come without really knowing why. "Brenda," Sarah said without taking her eyes off the window. "I see," Brenda said. "Keep doing what you're doing." Sarah went to the door and opened it. The press hummed behind her with that steady, constant sound she had learned to recognize as the voice of what she had built. The oil ran down the trough. Brenda worked at the counter without stopping, and through the open window at the back of the shed, the 61 acres of sunflowers stretched out in the morning sun, golden and immense and completely whole. Richard Sterling had his white hair combed as always, that controlled expression that was his trademark. Gerald had his greying moustache and a demeanor that this time couldn't manage to come across as friendly. Sarah stood still in the doorway. She didn't walk toward them. She let them stay where they were. She picked up one of the bottles on the shelf near the entrance, one of the last from the morning batch, with the Miller's Pure Oil label clearly visible and the hand-drawn sunflower in the center. She raised it toward the 2 of them with the ease of someone presenting evidence that needs no words. Neither of them said anything. She didn't either. Mr. Benjamin had arrived a little before them without anyone calling, as had become the habit in recent weeks. He stood a bit behind inside the shed with that restrained smile that was all he had in terms of celebration. He saw the scene through the gap in the door and didn't move. Richard Sterling looked at the bottle. He looked at the field through the gap in the open window. He looked at Sarah. The controlled expression stayed in place, but there was something different in his eyes. That thing that happens when a man who has built his own life by being the one who determines what happens faces an outcome he didn't determine. Gerald Thorne was the first to move. He turned, walked to his car without a word, got in, and drove out of the yard, kicking up the same fine dust as when he had arrived. Richard lingered a moment longer. He looked at the sunflower field for a second that seemed longer than it was. Then he nodded slightly, a minimal gesture in the manner of someone acknowledging something without wanting to make a ceremony of it. He got in his car and drove away. The yard fell quiet. The sound of both engines faded down the dirt road. Sarah lowered her arm with the bottle slowly. Mr. Benjamin went to the door and stood beside her, looking out at the empty yard. "Is it over?" Brenda asked from inside, without stopping her work. "It's over," said Sarah. There was a stillness in that moment that was different from ordinary silence. It was the kind of stillness that settles after something truly ends, not the silence beforehand, which is full of expectation, but the silence afterward, which is full of resolved reality. Mr. Benjamin looked out at the field for a while, at the 61 acres that swayed in the morning wind, golden as they had always been, as Sarah's father had planted them to be, as she had ensured with her own hands they would remain. 61 acres, he said almost to himself. 61, Sarah confirmed. The press continued humming behind them, the oil continued flowing, and the sunflowers continued swaying in the morning wind, as they always had, as Sarah's father had planted them to do, as she had ensured with her own hands they would keep doing. The land was hers. The end. Let us know what you thought of this story that touched our hearts. If you have something to share, leave a comment with sincere words. Do you think Sarah did the right thing by not giving up? Hit like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other heartwarming stories like this one.